When it all started, nobody called it a crisis. Sarah was 42 years old, worked in an administrative office, and had lived in the same neighborhood for over a decade. Nothing luxurious, nothing precarious, an organized life. She reviewed spreadsheets during the day and at night sat down with a notebook to write down expenses. Not because she was in debt, but because she liked to be in control. For the first time, however, those notes began to not add up as they once did. John woke up every day at 5:30 in the morning. He was a father of two, worked in maintenance, and always prided himself on never having missed a payment. When the price of fuel went up again, he did what he always did, recalculated his route, cut small expenses, and decided to work a few extra hours. For him, this was still manageable. Difficult, but manageable. Marcus worked for ride-sharing apps and did some temporary jobs. He had gradually built a stable routine after years of trying to establish himself. He paid his rent on time, helped his mother, and saved a little whenever he could. When customers started reducing tips and the platforms changed their payment rules, he felt the impact immediately. Even so, he didn't think about collapse. He thought about adaptation. The three lived different realities, but shared the same feeling. Something was changing. But it didn't seem serious enough to cause panic. Supermarket just got more expensive. Rent consumed a larger portion of the income. Saving money required more effort. None of this seemed extraordinary. Life went on. Sarah cut back on small things. Canceled a subscription. You postponed a trip. She told herself it was just an odd period. John decided to use part of his savings to cover a tighter month, convinced it would soon pay off. Marcus accepted more rides, more hours, more physical strain, believing that working harder would solve everything. And at that stage, everyone was right to think that way. Historically, the first phase of a collapse never frightens people. It presents itself as a temporary challenge, something that responsible people can overcome with organization and effort. That's precisely why almost no one reacts differently. Trust still exists. The system still appears to be functional. The future still seems possible. But it is at this moment that the gears begin to turn against those in the middle of society, not quickly, not visibly. Just enough to demand more sacrifices month after month. This is the phase in which the middle class begins to adjust frequently. And when this happens, the process is already underway, even if no one calls it by name. After the initial phase, crises are not announced by sudden drops. They begin with minor misalignments, things that, in isolation, seem normal. The first sign almost always appears in basic costs. Not in luxury goods, but in recurring expenses, rent, transportation, food, essential services. Sarah realizes this when she compares identical expenses from different periods and notices that the increase doesn't correspond to any real income gain. It's not an isolated purchase, it's a pattern. When this type of adjustment starts happening in several areas at the same time, the system begins to lose predictability. The second sign appears in work. John remains employed, but the overtime hours no longer pay off. The additional effort doesn't generate any profit margin. Historically, this is a critical point. When working more no longer improves one's financial situation, the economy is transferring risk to the individual. The third sign appears in variable and informal income. Marcus feels this quickly when platforms reduce bonuses, adjust fees, and change rules without warning. During periods of economic stress, this type of income acts as a buffer for the system. When it loses stability, the impact spreads rapidly. So far, none of this seems like a crisis. But together, these signs always appear before major ruptures. Another important indicator is the use of credit. It's not emergency credit, but everyday credit. When people start using credit cards to maintain their standard of living, not to expand it, something has changed. Credit ceases to be a tool and becomes a bridge between insufficient income and rising costs. This behavior is repeated in virtually all major modern crises. The most common mistake at this stage is interpreting each signal in isolation. Historically, crises reveal themselves through set-not because of a single event. The third phase begins when adjustments cease to solve problems and merely postpone decisions. This is an important point because many people confuse adaptation with control. Historically, they are different things. Adapting means changing habits. Losing control means no longer having real alternatives. The first sign of this phase is forced reduction of options. Sarah realizes this when reviewing her budget. She can't find anywhere else to cut. Subscriptions have already been canceled. Extra expenses have disappeared. What's left are fixed expenses. When the margin disappears, any unforeseen event takes on a disproportionate weight. This pattern appears before practically every crisis that affects the middle class. The second sign is thetrating planning for reaction. John stops thinking about months ahead and starts organizing his life in short cycles. Week by week, bill by bill. This isn't a lack of discipline. It's a classic indicator of economic stress. When the financial horizon shortens, the system no longer offers predictability. The third sign appears in strategic use of credit. Not to invest, not to expand, but to maintain stability. Installment payments increase. Terms are extended. Minimum payments become common. Historically, this behavior appears when income and cost of living cease to move in tandem. Another important indicator at this stage is that change in collective discourse. People aren't talking about a crisis yet, but they're starting to repeat phrases like, "Nobody is managing to save money. Everyone is strapped for cash. This is the new normal." When this type of normalization spreads, the risk ceases to be individual and becomes systemic. The third phase does not destroy the middle class. She mobilize. And this is crucial, because the next phase requires not only attention, it requires difficult decisions, and those who arrive there without any margin for error almost never manage to react in time. In the next part, we enter Phase 4, when personal liquidity starts to dwindle and the system begins to push losses more explicitly. The fourth phase begins when money still exists, but not available. This is an important technical point. Crises don't begin when income disappears, but when personal liquidity vanishes. Money becomes committed, paid in installments, and promised for the future. The first sign of this phase is increased reliance on revolving credit. Credit cards are being used to cover recurring expenses. Minimum payments are becoming frequent. This indicates that current income is no longer sufficient to cover the cost of living. The second sign is the depletion of reserve savings, emergency funds, and small reserves are consumed to maintain normalcy. When this happens on a large scale, the system is transferring risk to families. The third sign is the financial rigidities. Small unforeseen events can lead to major imbalances. Any delay, fine, or unexpected increase generates a domino effect. At this stage, the middle class is still standing, but it has lost mobility. There is income, there is work, but almost no flexibility. This is when the margin disappears completely. The next phase no longer depends on individual choices. It happens when the external environment begins to exert direct pressure and escape ceases to be a simple option. The fifth stage begins when problems cease to be manageable at the individual level. Up to this point, the loss has been silent and widespread. From this point on, it becomes concentrated. External decisions are beginning to directly impact the financial lives of families, leaving no room for adaptation. The first sign is thorough change. Costs rise abruptly, contracts are readjusted, benefits are reduced, and credit policies become more restrictive. This is not an isolated event. It is a coordinated movement of institutional protection. The second sign is the simultaneous squeeze. Rent, insurance, interest rates, and essential services are all putting pressure on the economy simultaneously. Historically, crises accelerate when multiple cost drivers move together, eliminating escape routes. The third sign is the explicit transfer of risk. Institutions preserve liquidity while families absorb losses. When this happens, the middle class ceases to be a buffer and becomes the target. At this stage, perception changes. People no longer ask how to adjust, but what to sell, what to delay, what to sacrifice. The system is no longer tightening. It's selecting. The final stage begins when this selection becomes irreversible. The sixth phase doesn't begin with a break. It begins when returning to the previous point is no longer possible. At this stage, the middle class still exists, but it no longer moves as it once did. Wealth has been reduced. Liquidity has disappeared. The capacity to react has been consumed throughout the previous phases. The system no longer needs to exert pressure, has already reorganized itself. The clearest sign of this phase is Permanent change of pattern families accept a lower standard of living is permanent.
Oh.
Decisions that were once temporary become permanent.
Oh.
The goal ceases to be growth and becomes a minimum level of stability. Another indicator is the asymmetric reconstruction. While institutions recover margins, individuals start from scratch of and in debt. Historically, this is the moment when real redistribution happens, not through policy, but through attrition. This is where most people look back and realize they didn't lose everything at once. It lost phase by phase. And that's why these collapses are almost never recognized while they're happening. By the time they become clear, they're already over.